For the foreign participants this morning, just a very brief welcoming remark. My name is Sung Lee, Korea's Ambassador for Human Rights, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome Mr. Michael Kirby, who is of course responsible for the COI report. And in the 2 short days that he's visiting here, which will end tonight, he has really achieved already quite significant milestones, having met with our president yesterday, foreign minister, and this morning with the Minister of Unification. Also had a very successful lecture at Yonsei University yesterday, and has already gone through, I think, losing count, but 7 or 8 press conferences individually and in a multi-press setting. So, without further ado, may I introduce Michael Kirby, the former head chair of the COI.
In this room where it all began, where we had our first meetings when the COI was first established, I pay respects to the Korean people on both sides of the dividing line. It is for the Korean people that the work of the Commission of Inquiry has been performed, and for the world community's dedication to universal human rights. When the report of the COI was delivered to the Human Rights Council on the 17th of March of this year, the ambassador for the Democratic People's Republic of Korea said, "We have a saying in the Korean language, mind your own business." However, since the Charter of the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the many treaties of the United Nations, most of which North Korea has itself signed, human rights are everybody's business. It is something we share simply because we are human beings. I insist that I have been a judge in my country in very high courts for 34 years, and I approached the work of the Commission of Inquiry dedicated to due process and fairness and to finding and expressing the truth. I was not hostile to North Korea. I was determined that they would have a fair chance to have the accusations made against them considered carefully and honestly and reported faithfully to the United Nations and the world. In these remarks today, I want to leave a maximum time for Q&A, because I think that is a much more interactive way in which we can discuss and share knowledge about the work of the United Nations on North Korea. But a number of dates are helpful to understand how we reach this moment.
지금까지요. 이 시점에 도달하기까지 어떠한 일들을 우리가 했는가를 얘기하려면 수일이 몇 날 며칠이 걸리겠습니다.
The Human Rights Council resolved to appoint a commission of inquiry in March 2013, and most unusually, indeed uniquely, it did this without proceeding to a vote. Such was the strong belief in the international community that the condition of human rights in North Korea had to be investigated. The commissioners were appointed in May 2013 by the President of the Human Rights Council, who was the Polish ambassador to the United Nations in Geneva, Ambassador Herzl. I acknowledge the presence here today of His Excellency the Ambassador of Poland and His Excellency the Ambassador of Hungary. It is symbolic that ambassadors from 2 countries of the former Soviet bloc are here to be with us in solidarity for human rights for all people everywhere, no exceptions. The Commission had its first meeting in Geneva on the 1st of July 2013, and it resolved that it would proceed in an unusual way for Commission of Inquiry. It will proceed by public hearings to allow the allegations to be voiced in public, recorded, placed on the internet and available to the whole world. And that is what brought the three commissioners, Marzuki Darusman, former Attorney General of Indonesia, who is the ongoing Special Rapporteur for Human Rights in North Korea, and Sonia Biserko, who is a human rights specialist from Serbia, who has seen terrible cases of genocide in her own country, and the three of us were the Commission of Inquiry. On time, in budget, unanimous, and readable. But one of the advantages of having public hearings to address the 9-point mandate of the Commission was that we had witnesses who spoke very vividly and directly of their own experience, and we could quote them in our report as we did. Our report is full of the statements of authentic victims of human rights, speaking directly to the highest levels of the United Nations and to the world. And when North Korea at the end denounced the witnesses as human scum who were hostile to its brave social experiment, we could only say, take a look online, have a look for yourself, reach your own conclusions as to whether these are honest people or whether they are human scum. Every Korean person here especially should go online and have a look at the witnesses who gave testimony in Seoul, in Tokyo, in London and in Washington DC, because they are part of the record of the history of the Korean people. The report was delivered online in the English language version only on the 17th of February 2014, and that is when we had a big media conference in Geneva to deliver the report. The report was then formally presented to the Human Rights Council in Geneva on the 17th of March 2014, St. Patrick's Day, and it was presented with a number of side events which allowed Korean NGOs to speak in Geneva of the cause for which they had struggled. The Human Rights Council then adopted the substance of our report by a very large vote, 30 member states supporting the resolution, and it is interesting that every one of the former Soviet bloc who were members of the Human Rights Council voted in favour of the report, including Kazakhstan, countries which had experienced autocratic rule lined up with supporting human rights in North Korea. So many countries which were in the room, and even if not members of the Human Rights Council, who had formerly been communist countries, came up to us and thanked us and praised the report. Albania and the Czech Republic and Poland, they all said that this was a report that had to be delivered, and they accepted it and they praised it. Then, out of time, out of its order, a number of members of the Security Council asked for an urgent briefing by the Commission of Inquiry. On the 17th of April, 3 countries in the Security Council, the French Republic, the United States of America, and Australia, resolved that there should be a so-called ARIA briefing, a briefing of the members of the Security Council on the report of the COI. Of the 15 members of the Security Council, 13 attended the briefing. There were empty seats for the Russian Federation and for China, but all of the other members of the Security Council attended. Of the 13 members attending, 11 spoke, and of the 11 who spoke, 9 expressly endorsed the proposal that North Korea should be referred to the International Criminal Court. Such was the shocking evidence of crimes against humanity revealed in the report of the COI. The report will go back to the General Assembly of the United Nations. Take my, excuse me.
이쪽에 앉으시래요.
Take my envelope. Just remove my envelope. You can say, I'm going to be on my feet.
계속 서 계실 거니까 앉아 계셔도 된다고 하시네요.
There's a seat in the front here. If there's
예,
anybody
앞에 자리
standing at the
있습니다.
back.
서 계신 분 앞으로 와서 앉으시고요.
This is a democracy.
네.
The report will go to the General Assembly probably in September, and hopefully it will then be formally sent on to the Security Council. Since the report was delivered, there have been a number of developments which may indicate straws in the wind that North Korea is beginning to realize the strength of the feeling in the international community that the continuation of such great crimes against its own people is intolerable to the civilized community who expect change. In the last 4 weeks, North Korea has been more cooperative at the Human Rights Council in its Universal Periodic Review. In the past, it did not accept a single one of the recommendations for improvement of human rights in North Korea, and remains the only state of the United Nations which has refused every recommendation of the rest of the world for improvement of human rights. But they've just started to say that some things will be looked at. Second, they have agreed to monitoring of food aid. In the past, they have not allowed proper monitoring, which is a standard requirement, to make sure that food aid goes without discrimination to those who most need it, and not just to the elite. They have accepted that they will be required to undertake, allow the United Nations and other bodies to properly monitor food aid. Thirdly, they have reached an agreement with Japan to reopen the case of the abductees from Japan, and that has been reached in the last couple of days. And fourthly, they have agreed to send a team to the Asian Games, which will be held in Incheon in the Republic of Korea. People-to-people contact of that kind is a very important aspect of the recommendations of the COI, but it didn't get very much publicity. But there is, for example, absolutely no reason why the dentists of North Korea should not come and meet with the dentists of South Korea, and vice versa, just to exchange technical knowledge, and that is the sort of thing that should open up the contact between the two communities. Also within the last days has been the announcement that the Republic of Korea has agreed to host a field office which will be based in South Korea for the purpose of continuing the recording of the testimony of people who have suffered human rights deprivations. A lot of people so loved the COI that they wanted it to go on forever, but we said no way. The COI should discharge its mission within a year, because we didn't want to shift the responsibility from those who bear responsibility for achieving real progress, which means the member states of the United Nations. The obligation is upon politicians and diplomats, and if the COI had just gone on, people would have had an excuse not to take the responsibility for action. Now they have no excuse, and they have to take their responsibility to follow up the report and recommendations. The COI made many findings of crimes against humanity under the headings of its mandate in respect of the secret political prisons, the abductions of people, not only from Japan, but very large numbers of abductions from the Republic of Korea, discrimination against women, discrimination against people on the ground of religion, discrimination against people on the ground of their songbird, and also discrimination against people generally on the basis of the right to food. 1 million people at least died in the Great Famine of 1995 in North Korea. On this short visit, I've had the honour of being received by the President, President Park, at the Blue House yesterday, and I met, as Ambassador Lee has said, a number of ministers, representatives of universities, of the professions, representatives of non-governmental organisations, and above all students, university students and school students, because the future belongs to them, and our duty is to the future of the Korean people. I will finish as I began, by paying respects to the representatives of civil society who are here. A mark of freedom in a free society is the strength of civil society, the strength of the NGOs. And I insist that NGOs don't always agree with government. They sometimes disagree very strongly with government. And you can tell a free society by the number and vigour and strength of NGOs. And I have to pay a tribute to the NGOs that are present here today and were present at the beginning of this journey, insisting on the rights of people everywhere, including in North Korea, to fundamental human rights respect. We will now have a Q&A session, but first we will have a big round of applause, which in the manner of the recorded speeches in the Kremlin back in 1945 or 1958 will be recorded in the transcript as thunderous prolonged applause.
진행을 하기 전에 먼저 그 연사에게 박수를 보내주셔야 된다고 말씀을 하셨습니다. 박수를 부탁드립니다.
Now, are there any questions or comments? This is a free society and you don't have to agree with anything that I've just said. Any abductee anywhere is a victim of a crime against humanity. It is a very serious international crime. And I'm hoping that the proposal of the COI that North Korea be referred to the International Criminal Court or some other judicial tribunal will come about, because that would be a way by which this kind of offence against the whole international community could be properly investigated and accountability achieved. Accountability for crimes against humanity is essential. You and your family have suffered greatly, and I assure you that you will never be forgotten by the United Nations, and I am confident that in due course of time there will be accountability of some kind, and certainly the report of the COI demands it. Of course, as a practical matter, it is easier to respond to 17 than to 100,000. But I am still hopeful and expectant that in due course of time there will be a response to all of the matters identified in the COI report. And you should keep demanding. It is your right in a free country to keep demanding a response from your government and the officials, and you should never give up. Remember, Winston Churchill had a motto: never give up, never give up, never give up.
Thank you. I'm so glad to see you here in Seoul. I have two questions. One is, you said at the 25th Human Rights Council session, there's no similar examples to North Korea in the contemporary world. But you compared it with the historical cases like Nazi and Khmer Rouge. I want to hear your explanation of the background of your idea. The second one is, why is the archives of North Korean human rights violations is so important? What roles it can have? I want to hear your explanation.
When I sat there in the public hearings here in Seoul, and I heard a witness describe his job, which was to pick up bodies of people who had died in the secret prison camps, political prison camps, put them in a wheelbarrow, wheel them to a vat, put them in the vat, burn them, and then they didn't fully burn, take the ashes and take the arms and legs that had not burned and put them in the field nearby in North Korea as fertilizer. It reminded a person of my age of the newsreels, black and white, of General Eisenhower and General Montgomery reaching the concentration camps in Eastern Europe, in Poland, in the Czech Republic, and in Germany. And their look of distaste and shock is still on my mind as a little boy seeing these movies. And so that's what I thought of. This is a repetition of something that we established the Charter and the Universal Declaration to prevent and avoid. So that's why I saw an analogy to both the post-Second World War and the Khmer Rouge period of shocking and crimes which disrespected a human being, a human life. I say to the Korean students at the back of the hall, this is your country we are talking about. This is your people. It is not your nation, but it is your country and your people. And it is the responsibility of the whole world, but it is the special responsibility of the Korean people to demand accountability for wrongs of this kind. This is not incompatible with humanitarian aid to people in desperate need in North Korea. That should continue. And it is not incompatible with reunification, which is the ultimate solution to many of the problems. But reunification can only come about on a stable basis if it is based on truth. The second question related to the archives. We also considered that the proper archiving of our material, which is online anyway, but its archiving was very important and should also protect the confidentiality of the evidence that was given to us in confidence, because some people would not give public testimony because they have family in North Korea. The archiving of the work of the new field office is also going to be very important, and you can be assured that that will be equally carefully protected and kept as the record of part of the history, a sad part of the history of the Korean people. Is there a question from any of the students right at the very back?
학생들 중에 질문 있으십니까?
We give students a right in this.
학생들에게 권리를 드리겠습니다.
Okay, is there a student? Okay, you stand up if you would.
서주시겠어요? 일어나주시겠어요?
And just speak loudly, and
크게 말씀하세요.
it will be translated into the
번역해
microphone.
드리겠습니다.
Hello, Mr. Kirby. I'm from the Hanyang Foreign Language High School. I'm a junior year. And even as a high schooler in South Korea, we barely know and have little interest in the human rights of our neighboring country. And I wanted to know how we could raise awareness of this matter.
Somebody else said this to me yesterday, and I tried to imagine what if Tasmania in Australia had a terrible, shocking human rights record. I cannot imagine that we would not be engaged with it. Maybe it is just that it's been going on for so long and people don't know any solution and they feel helpless, so they think of positive things that takes their mind away. I think Korea in its social organisation is quite a conservative society, and I think maybe it would be a good thing if the NGOs had youth wings. That is to say, groups, they had the wise old owls, but also had a group who could cater for and engage and involve young people in their activities, like a youth group of Amnesty International or a youth group of Koreans for Liberty in North Korea, or if they could set up their own special sections and engage teachers, that would be a way to engage the students of South Korea in the predicament which is afflicting people their own age, their own language, their own history, just 100 kilometres from here. So that is a challenge for the wise old owls of the NGO community to think of a way to have a regular magazine for students about what is happening, what's the latest news, and for example, the team going to the Asian Games. I think that's a good development, and covering that and photographs, and I think they'll be very closely guarded, but it's a definite development in the right direction. We should be encouraging people-to-people contact. Human beings are basically the same everywhere, and it's just governments that get in the way. Any student in the very back row who has a
맨
question?
뒷줄에 있는 학생 중에서 질문 있으신가요? So what would you say about the UN's sanction to North Korea? Sanctions.
Yes, well, this was considered by the Commission of Inquiry, and there is a section in the report. You can have access, anybody in the Republic of Korea can have access to the report, to the public hearings, to the transcript of the public hearings in Korean as well as in English, and in the other UN languages. It's all online, all available to you. They can't in North Korea. In North Korea, they probably don't know that a COI ever existed. But you can have a look at it and you can see. In that report, the issue of sanctions is expressly dealt with. In North Korea, the situation is still so dire and food is still so short that the Commission of Inquiry was not in favour of any sanctions that would add to the burdens of the ordinary people. But there is evidence that the elite live extremely well, and that large numbers of very expensive imports of food and wine and other stuffs are still coming into North Korea, so that the Commission of Inquiry urged that specific, finely targeted sanctions should be addressed to these imports, so as to hit the elite where it hurts them. Don't think that sanctions don't work, because you'll remember the ship that was caught in the Panama Canal and was arrested, boarded, investigated, and it was found that underneath the bags of sugar were parts of MiG fighters, fighter planes, which breached the UN Security Council sanctions and that led to the arrest of the captain and the crew and of the confiscation of the military items which are contrary to sanctions of the Security Council, which, by the way, have been agreed to by the Russian Federation and by China. I think it's interesting that the Russian Federation and China voted for those sanctions, and it's part of the suggestions of the COI that the sanctions on human rights violations should be tacked on to the Security Council sanctions relating to peace and security, because the human rights sanctions cause instability in a country which possesses 20 nuclear weapons. And therefore, the killing of Jang Song-tek in that dramatic fashion last December is an indication that it is not business as usual in North Korea. It was a rapid removal from power and brutal execution of the second or third most important man in the whole country. We must never forget that the United Nations would not have been established except for the great sacrifices of the Russian people in the Second World War. And the Russian people, through their representatives, have supported the UN sanctions based on military armaments, and my hope is that they see the interconnection between military and peace and security and the issue of human rights, because if you don't respect human rights, you have inevitable instability at home. Okay, any other questions?
So what motivated the Commission to expose and put on the spot a country that was not the object of the reporting, China? And how do you see the prospects of China recognizing North Korean defectors as refugees in need of international protection, allowing them to eventually come to the Republic of Korea if they wish so? I'm from East Germany. I wanted to also express my professional and personal emotions reading the report, and I think one day a street in Pyongyang will be named after you and the other members of the COI, that day hopefully not being so far from today. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that last comment. I'm not holding my breath. The question is, why did the COI refer to China and criticize China when its report was supposed to be on North Korea? The answer to that question is that we were addressing the human rights of people from North Korea being sent back into North Korea from China without respect for their rights as refugees under the Refugee Convention, and knowing that in some cases they would suffer extremely grave punishments, including death, because of the fact that they had left their country. And therefore it did involve the human rights of Korean people and the human rights of Korean mothers and children with children born to Chinese fathers are extremely acutely involved in China. And though it is in China, this is all connected to North Korea because of the large body of refugees in the borderland territories of China, including 25,000 children who can't be registered for school, although that would be their right in China, because by registering them, the mothers would be exposing themselves to automatic repatriation to North Korea. So the children are utterly innocent, and yet their human rights are not being respected, and they too are not being respected because they are of Korean derivation. So it's all connected to Korea, and it was within our mandate. China is obviously very worried about a flood of North Korean refugees, but China is a party to the Refugees Convention and Protocol. Under that treaty, they are obliged to give protection to people who have a well-founded fear of persecution if they are returned to their country of origin. And in the case of North Koreans, particularly North Korean women, there is a well-founded fear of persecution if they are returned, and therefore China has to be told, if you sign on to international treaties, you must conform to their requirements. By the way, some of the most interesting reading connected with the report is of the archival material of the ambassador for the Democratic German Republic, DDR, writing home to Berlin about the excesses of the fraternal comrades in North Korea. And similarly, the Soviet ambassador and the ambassador from other East European countries, it's all footnoted in our report with links to the relevant material translated into English, which shows that they were already regarded during the Soviet period as a country which had gone mad with its personality cult and that was exceeding any of the worst offences that had occurred in their own country, and there was great concern being expressed that this would lead to the overthrow of the regime and to international horror at what was happening. It's very interesting reading that the archives of the Soviet Union and the archives of the German Democratic Republic and of Hungary and other countries in Eastern Europe have now been opened, so you can go back and see what the ambassadors were reporting, and it wasn't nice. I have so much information in my head that if only we could make it into a memory stick and I could give it to you, it would be a very interesting. They'll be able to do that in due course, and it'll probably be done by a Korean technologist. But let us have 3 short questions and 3 short answers. Okay?
To be referred to the ICC, it might take some time, but in the meantime, to improve the human rights of North Korean people, what kind of measures can be taken? The first question. And second question is, if it is referred to ICC, then what UN Security Council can do about it once it is referred to ICC?
Well, first of all, I'll take the second question first. If the matter goes to the Security Council, then there must be a vote. And under the Charter of the United Nations, it requires for a substantive decision the concurring vote of all the permanent 5, which means China and Russia. So if they do vote in favour of a referral, then the matter would go off to the International Criminal Court, because that is the second way in which that court can get jurisdiction. The first way is if a country is a party to the Rome Statute that sets up the court. Well, North Korea is not. The second way is by a resolution of the Security Council, and that is why that has to go through the requirement of the permanent 5 voting for it.
To be referred to the ICC, it might take some time, but in the meantime, to improve the human rights of North Korean people, what kind of measures can be taken? The first question. And second question is, if it is referred to ICC, then what UN Security Council can do about it once it is referred to ICC?
Well, first of all, I'll take the second question first. If the matter goes to the Security Council, then there must be a vote. And under the Charter of the United Nations, it requires for a substantive decision the concurring vote of all the permanent 5, which means China and Russia. So if they do vote in favour of a referral, then the matter would go off to the International Criminal Court, because that is the second way in which that court can get jurisdiction. The first way is if a country is a party to the Rome Statute that sets up the court. Well, North Korea is not. The second way is by a resolution of the Security Council, and that is why that has to go through the requirement of the permanent 5 voting for it.
So what was the first one? Second, the resolution, but the first one.
Well, the first question, I was answering the second part of the question. The first part of the question was, if it doesn't get through the ICC, what can then be done practically for the human rights of the people of North Korea? My answer to that question is that practical outcomes will not be helped by not mentioning human rights in case it upsets North Korea. I'm sorry, but that strategy has not worked and will not work. They have contempt and disrespect if the Republic of Korea and other countries simply back off in case it upsets them. It is necessary to have a clear principle, and the clear principle is that we live in the age of the Charter of the United Nations, and it has the dedication to universal human rights expressed in the great treaties, and you don't help the people of North Korea by not mentioning it. It has to be expressed, and it has to be based on principle, and the principle is the Charter of the United Nations, and to which North Korea is a party, and the great treaties of human rights that have been made under the United Nations. I'm hopeful that when the field office is established in Seoul, that it will have the eyes and ears of the United Nations on possibilities that can be explored to, without interfering in local politics, possibilities that can be explored to increase the person-to-person contacts between North Korea and South Korea. I think that's very important, and young people especially should be advancing this idea of the professions meeting, the sporting people meeting, apprentices meeting, university students meeting. This is not an alien idea. We're all living on this one little planet, and these are people who speak the same language and have the same cultural history, and they should be able to communicate with each other. They should be able to post a letter to each other, or pick up a telephone and speak to each other, or use the Skype to do so. I say to the young people, just imagine if you could not have Facebook and if you didn't have Reddit. I am now a big world expert on Reddit and dialogue with blogs on the internet. It would be unimaginable for you, but that is the case of young people in North Korea. Right at the very back row in the center.
맨 뒤줄에 가운데 계신 분.
Hi, I just wanted to ask you, because the COI has made this very comprehensive report, and you said that the mission of the COI has been accomplished by documenting human rights abuses in the language that the international community will understand. And now that the responsibility is in the hands of diplomats, UN member states, and countries. So I just wanted to ask you if you could elaborate a little bit further on the field office that will be established in South Korea in terms of what mechanisms it's going to use, what's going to be its role, and how people like us, NGO representatives and students can work with this field office.
Okay. Maybe you just translate the essence of that. How's the field office going to be? So I'm not involved in the setting up of the field office. It was in the report of the COI, but it's now being handled by representatives of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva and the government of the Republic of Korea. So the modalities are still being worked out, and I think you just have to watch this space. But it will be created. It will be created quickly. The discussions will be happening within the next fortnight, and it will be based in South Korea, and it will be a presence in South Korea which will, in a sense, keep on the ears and voice of the United Nations, which is a good thing. In the COI, we had a very clear distinction in our mind between family abduction and prisoners of war. But the fact is that ultimately they had a common link, and that was that they ended up involuntarily in North Korea and could not go back to their homes as they wished. And therefore, our attention was on both aspects, and they're dealt with at length in our report, and it is a grievous case of serious human rights violations on the part of North Korea. Unfortunately, North Korea was very deceitful, particularly about prisoners of war. It's now revealed in the Soviet archives that Stalin said, "We know you have more prisoners of war," and Kim Il-sung owned up to having more, but he said, "We've told them less." So it specifically spelled out that North Korea deliberately understated the numbers of prisoners of war that it had seized and retained. Do you remember the family reunion last year? We are supposed to be grateful that 80 families have a reunion. It is disgraceful that in this day and age people are living just 100 kilometres or more from each other and they cannot see their blood relatives. I insist we should not be feeling grateful. We should be insistent that people should have a right to make contact with their families. It isn't spelled out expressly in international human rights law. It's just a natural part of our human being, humanness, that we want to know and love and embrace our families. And it's a shocking thing that they have a ballot and allow a tiny number of people who apply to have family reunions. This is one of the true disgraces of the Korean Peninsula, and I hope that it will continue to be a pressure for an opening up, a real opening up of access to related members of the Korean family on both sides of this artificial border, which was imposed on the Korean people by military force and not by the agreement of the Korean people themselves. And we've had a very good session today, a very interactive session. We've run out of time for more questions. However, we're going to have a break now, and then we can have selfies for anybody in the back of the audience. And I'd like, on your behalf, to thank our wonderful interpreter for bridging the gulf between the languages so that we as human beings could share our thoughts together, which is the era of the Charter and the era of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Thank you.